Today I'm talking about how to maximize the effectiveness of exposure therapy for panic disorder, for OCD, for social phobia, for other phobias, other anxieties, agoraphobia, and PTSD. Hi, I'm Paige Pradko. Welcome to Therapy for a Better Life. I have a client, a male in his 50s, and he came in to see me with very severe contamination OCD, and he also had kind of this exactness and orderliness or OCD as well. He experienced 6 to 7 hour showers, 2-hour hand washes, and really his life was just very controlled by the OCD. So for treatment, we started doing very traditional ERP. We created hierarchies, we worked our way up the hierarchy. He had a lot of success, and his hand washing and showering came down to very reasonable times, and at that point he decided to terminate therapy. Well, he called me a few months later, and all of his symptoms had returned. His showers, his hand washing, everything had returned, almost as if we never did exposure therapy. So what do you think happened? Why did the exposure therapy fail? Well, I wanted to know the same thing, and I began really researching. And I found out that, many times exposure therapy fails. About 40 to 50% of the time, people do not improve. And their fear comes back, and all of their symptoms come back in 20 to 62% of the time. But we can improve this. I've dug into the research, a lot of very recent new research, and have discovered 10 ways to really help make exposures stick. Now, I'm going to be reviewing the research. A few of the key neuroscientists in this particular area are Joseph Ledoux and Michelle Kratzky. Joseph Ledoux wrote a book a few years ago called Anxious: Using the Brain to Understand and Treat Fear and Anxiety. It's a fairly technical book, but has a lot of great information in it. So what happens during an exposure is that our brain is learning, and it's putting down a brand new neural pathway in our brain to teach us that whatever it was that we feared, we really don't have to fear that thing, whatever it is, a thought, maybe we're afraid of spiders, whatever it is, or panic attacks, that whatever we feared, we can put ourselves in that environment, we can expose ourselves to that thought, and our brain learns that we're not in danger. But the old original fear, that neural pathway of the old original fear never goes away, and it's very strong. And there are certain things that can make our new neural pathway actually dissolve. For example, if we let a lot of time go by and we're not exposing ourselves to those situations or thoughts or objects, if we're not doing that, the new neural pathway fades. If I have social phobia and I don't go to a party for another 4 months or socialize regularly, my original fear is going to come back. Now, another thing that can happen is that if we only practice in one certain context, for example, if I'm afraid of elevators and I only do my exposure on one elevator, my exposure therapy is specific to that one elevator. I can have a panic attack on another elevator. And so we have to make sure that our context is very varied, that we're doing exposure therapy in every possible situation, as every elevator, with people, without people, different times of the day, to really make a solid new neural pathway and good exposure. And the third thing of reason why exposures can fail is if we have unexpected trauma, unexpected negative events and loss. And this is exactly what happened to my client. He had many different unexpected losses and trauma after he had finished exposure therapy. And the exposure, he was not doing them enough. They weren't strong enough at that time to make it last. So I'm going to review with you today 10 key points on making your exposures last. Not a lot of therapists know this information. It's very new information. So please take notes. It's very, very critical that you don't waste your time on exposures that don't work and really incorporate these ideas into your exposures to make sure that they last. I'm going to just right now remind you to please subscribe and like the video if you're gaining new information. It helps me feel like I'm actually doing something that matters and that people are actually interested and would like me to do more of these videos. And that reminds me, if you have a great topic that you'd like me to cover, please let me know. I'm always interested in what my subscribers would like me to talk about. So let's get to those 10 ways to design into our exposures when we're doing them. It's always helpful to work with a therapist, but if you do not have a therapist available to you for whatever reason, you can do this on your own. Just take these things into account when you're designing your exposures. So the first one that I'd like you to remember, number one, is it's called violate what you expect. And that is that if you fear having a panic attack when you go to the grocery store, and then you do an exposure at the grocery store, and you learn that you did not have a panic attack, and so you expected to have a panic attack, you did the exposure, you did not have a panic attack. There's a mismatch. That's what we want in an exposure therapy. That's how your brain learns. Oh, she didn't have a panic attack, and your brain learns grocery stores are not dangerous. And so we want to have a mismatch. We want you to violate what you expect in every exposure. Number two is we want multiple contexts. I talked about that a moment ago, if you remember, with the elevator. We want to mix it up as much as we can for every exposure. Our original fear of whatever the thought or the situation or the object was that you're afraid of, the original fear generalizes across to everything. Our exposures don't generalize. Our exposures are only on what we do the exposure on. And so we have to mix it up as much as we can. If we have contamination fear, we have to put ourselves in all kinds of situations and exposures where we fear we're contaminated. If we have a fear of having a panic attack when we're away from our house, we have to do all kinds of exposures away from our house in all kinds of situations, alone, with other people, different times of the day. Mix it up as much as you possibly can. So important. Number three, scheduling exposures. We have learned that it is important to do an exposure, take a 10-minute break, and then do another exposure. It's a process in the brain that's happening. So you always want to do an exposure, 10-minute break, do another exposure. It's also better to do several different series of exposures instead of one big long one. We've learned that too in research. And we've learned something interesting, that when our brain is trying to learn, do an exposure, and then as soon as you can after the exposure, take a nap, or do it at the very end of the day and go to bed. Our brain learns new information and consolidates it into memory when we have a protein synthesis that happens when we're sleeping. And so this is even important when you're studying for an exam. Study and then go to bed, because that's how the memory gets consolidated in the brain. Very important. Number four, we have learned that cognitive therapy, or CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, really hurts exposure therapy. We don't want to do any cognitive reconstructing. We don't want to change our thoughts and talk about why we shouldn't be afraid of such and such. It makes the exposure less effective. And I think a lot of therapists are doing this wrong. We don't want to do any cognitive restructuring or cognitive therapy until after exposure therapy is completely 100% over. That's a very interesting point, but true. And any of those little phrases that you say to yourself to get yourself through the exposure, those are not going to be helpful. they actually make the exposure less effective. So don't try to say anything or do any kind of relaxing or do anything to bring your fear down during an exposure. Our fear has to stay up. Our amygdala has to be activated in the fear center. Number 5, we want to vary the stimulus or the feared object. So whatever the feared object is, if it's public speaking, you want to vary it and have as many different ways of public speaking, different audiences, different ways that you can. If you're afraid of spiders, you want to do exposure therapy on as many of different kinds of spiders. If it's a fearful thought, you want to do it as many kinds of ways that you can hit that fearful thought and many different fearful thoughts. We want to vary it. And we also want to vary the intensity of our fear. The old way of working up the hierarchy, in fact, I even talked about that in a video, is we don't want to do that anymore. We want to switch it all up. It makes the exposure more effective. We want to maybe we start low, but then we might go high and then we might go medium, and we're going to mix up the hierarchy of fears all over the place so that our emotion is not just exactly the same going into every exposure. Skip it around. Number 6, we want to label our emotion as we're going through it, actually before, during, and after the exposure. So before, I'm afraid, I'm really scared to do this. I'm feeling terrified. During the exposure, this is really uncomfortable for me. I don't like this. I'm really afraid. Maybe after the exposure, okay, I'm feeling relieved. I'm really glad I'm done. I thought it was going to be a little bit worse than it was. Number 7 is we want to have occasional bad experience in exposure. So every once in a while, let's say that I am afraid I'm going to have a panic attack. Again, I always use the grocery store, picking on grocery stores. I'm afraid I'm going to have a panic attack in a grocery store. And let's say I do several different exposures, different times of the day, different grocery stores. Sometimes I'm with people, sometimes I'm not. And all of a sudden, I have a panic attack, and I hadn't had one in a long time. That's good for exposure therapy because it teaches your brain to tolerate anxiety, tolerate fear, and it makes it stronger if every once in a while we have a bad exposure. Don't let it, kind of discourage you. It's really good for lasting exposure therapy. The next one, number 8, is we want to wean off the safety behaviors. I've talked about this in other videos as well. Sometimes we need safety behaviors at the very beginning of exposures. For someone that's agoraphobic, they might want somebody with them going to different locations at first. Over time, we want to wean that off through our exposure therapy experience. We want to wean any safety behaviors. They might be people, they might be carrying medicine with us, they might be, we have our phone there, whatever the safety behavior is, we want to wean that off. And no benzodiazepines, because that makes exposure therapy ineffective because it really just kind of numbs our nervous system and our brain can't learn. Number 9, we want to introduce a phobic stimulus very briefly 30 minutes before our exposure. So if we're going to do a contamination exposure, we very briefly introduce ourselves to a contamination, just briefly, before the exposure therapy, 30 minutes before. If we're doing an exposure on a thought, briefly introduce the thought to yourself and 30 minutes before. The science behind that may be that we're activating our amygdala. Remember that it has to be very active for an exposure to work. Let me see. The final number 10 is that we want to verbalize and kind of review after we've done an exposure therapy experience. Every single exposure, we want to review, verbalize what happened, what did we learn? It just consolidates it in our brain. So you can say to yourself, what did I fear? Well, I really feared doing public speaking. And, as I did the exposure, I went into my office and I did a presentation in front of a couple of people. What happened when you were there? Well, I was really anxious, but as I got going, I got a little bit more comfortable. Well, what did you learn from it? I learned that it wasn't quite as hard as I thought it was. I was pretty scared going into it, but I realized once I got going, my fear dropped, and I learned that it wasn't quite as bad as I thought. This is great because it is consolidating the learning into your brain. So I would love to hear again, in anything that you find interesting in the video. And I look forward to seeing you next time. So until then, I will see you in session. Take care. Bye-bye.